Welcome to Gaining the Technology Leadership Edge, a podcast for tech executives. We provide strategies and tactics to help executives succeed and further their career goals. With interviews from industry experts, leaders, and innovators, this show will surely get you on the edge of your seat with thought-provoking advice on how to stay ahead of the competition. All right, well, thank you so much for listening to Gaining the Technology Leadership Edge. This is our very first episode, and the show is going to bring to you the brightest minds in technology, with the idea being that you can learn more about your craft. Today's guest is Noah Healey. He's a game theorist working on better economic systems. After training in nuclear engineering, he worked for some tech startups. Studying the mathematics of computation led to patent work on a better market design. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me here, Mike.
So let's start off right at the top and let's have you explain what a game theorist is.
So game theory is the mathematics of strategy, and it deals with situations where you have multiple agendas. That can lead to situations of both conflict and cooperation. And there's a lot of counterintuitive things that we've learned over the last 100-ish years by studying game theory. But there's also a lot of optimizations that are available from actually getting your strategic picture sort of written down in numbers and figures, and being able to use some of these tools from operations research and other subjects like that.
Okay, so, I like to always bring things back to the real world for people. I mean, we're obviously, our audience is technology professionals, so they can pretty much handle what you give to them. But how would you apply this in the real world? Like, what would be a real world use case?
Well, one of the most prominent use cases for game theory is an application of something called the stable marriage algorithm, which is used to match up doctors with their residencies in the teaching hospitals. So the stable marriage algorithm basically sort of is based on this problem. Imagine a village with an equal number of boys and girls, each one of which has, whatever their preferences are. Can you come up with a set of marriages of these young people such that all the marriages are stable? That is, anyone matched with someone who isn't their first choice will not be able to break up the marriages of any of their higher than current partners' choices, because in each of those cases, the marriage will be to somebody that the other person prefers to themselves. And when first stated, it sounds like, well, that's, maybe it doesn't always work. It sounds like it would be very difficult. It turns out that, in fact, no matter what the two sides, assuming they're, equal sizes and stuff like that, no matter what the two sides' preferences are, there's actually always at least one stable arrangement. And there's actually a trivial algorithm that will give you one of the stable arrangements. And the trivial algorithm is you pick a side, boys, girls, usually boys, and line them up. And the guy at the front of the line picks the girl he wants to marry. And you just go down the line. If any guy picks a girl that's already been picked, then the girl gets to pick which one she prefers. And then that person goes to the back of the line and he can't pick her again. And once the line is finally exhausted, you're done. You found a stable arrangement. And that's actually how it works. The teaching hospitals have the results from the medical schools, and they list out who their favored persons are, what their criterions are, and the residents put their top few choices in. And in how we do the match, the teaching hospitals serve as the boys in this model, and they go out and they just pick the residents they want. And if two or more residents are picked by the same hospital, and the resident gets the one they like better, and that's how we do it.
Yeah, I was looking at the Wikipedia article on stable marriage algorithm, and that was the first thing that it talked about, was that the um, graduating medical students, matching them to their hospital appointments. That's kind of an interesting concept. But does it infer that that the match will be effective?
So the match will be effective, but it won't necessarily be ideal. In fact, there was a court case that was brought by residencies because in that particular way of coming up with a match, whichever side goes first, whatever side does the choosing, gets on average a better outcome than the other side. So by letting the medical schools go first, they would sort of get the better part of their picks over the residencies. So residents sued and said, hey, this is unfair, we should get better things. But the courts decided that, you know, since the hospitals are hospitals and have a lot more on the line and a lot more at risk, it was essentially right and fair that they should have this advantage. And so the courts held that they should continue to go first. There are also sort of psychotic cases that you can imagine in sort of a simple world where everyone's preferences are identical. So every girl's favorite boy is Adam, and every girl's second favorite is Bob, and every boy's favorite girl is Adele, and second favorite is Betty, and so on. Then Adam and Adele and Bob and Betty and Carol and Carl and so on would all just wind up matched up no matter what happens. But you could imagine a sort of psychotic situation where the preferences were perfectly inverted. So whichever, every boy's favorite girl would be the one who likes him the least, and second favorite girl would be the one who likes him the second least, and so on. Under those conditions, every single arrangement would actually be stable, because since everything's perfectly inverted, everyone that you like better than whoever you wind up with likes you less than whoever they wind up with. However, whichever side goes first basically gets a heaven-hell relationship. So if the boys go first, every one of them will get their unique first pick, and every girl will wind up with the boy that she finds most detestable. But if the girls were to go first, the exact opposite would occur, where every girl gets her first pick, but every boy would prefer any other girl to the one he's actually with.
It reminds me, I'm a chess player, and it kind of reminds me of white and black in chess. You know, white always goes first, and so white has a teeny tiny, like about a half a pawn advantage in every game, because they get to decide how the game is opened. And so, you know, it kind of sets the stage for what comes next. So that's kind of reminds me of that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, a lot of games have a first mover, you know, advantage type situation.
Yeah, yeah, and and I don't know, I hadn't ever thought about applying it to a situation like a matchmaker, you know, type of thing. That's kind of an interesting thing. And the theory there is that because of the way the interests are set up, that if they make their choice, that their chances are that it'll be stable. That's the theory.
Well, so yeah, the idea is, and you know, this is where it's a math problem and not the real world, is that if you have your preferences and your preferences are stable, if you take your top choice, then if somebody else were to kind of come in and say, wait a minute, what about me? Well, that person's not your top choice because they're not the one that you picked. So you're not going to abandon your top choice for a second or third or fourth choice that comes along and says, but wait, what about me? And as long as both sides feel that way. So if two people are with their third choices, there are people that could come in and disrupt that relationship. They could come in and say, hey, I'm your top choice, get rid of her, come along with me. But if you're that person's fifth choice and they're with their second choice, they're not gonna downgrade to come break up your situation. So
Yeah, that
that's where
wouldn't
the
make a lot of
stability
sense.
comes from. Right.
That would make a lot of sense. So let's talk a little bit about you and your career. It says here that you had training as in nuclear engineering. So
So
what
yeah,
got you into that?
I went to college in the 90s and didn't really have a particular direction in mind. I was in engineering school because I thought I'd have to write less, which sadly turned out to be false. And I was sort of following teachers around, like I didn't know what to do, and so I was trying out things that were interesting. And uh, some of the things that were interesting because the professors were good. And so then, the next year I'd be like, well, this professor's good and he's teaching that. Why don't I go learn about what that is and see what's going on? Um, so I was taking this class on reactor safety out of, no particular reason other than I liked the professor. And he introduced this concept, this physical concept called delayed neutrons, and said, without this physical thing, it would have been impossible for human beings to have commercially exploited nuclear power. And engineers, particularly larval, student engineers, react to the word impossible, rather badly. So we all, threw out some things of like, obviously you could do this, obviously you could do that. Well, he shot us down because we didn't know anything. Um, but I put my head down and tried to design this science fiction nuclear reactor that would actually answer his objections. And I came up with this pure, this is Star Wars technology, but like this gamma ray laser nuclear reactor that would have light speed reaction time for shutdown, so that you could actually like have a bomb inside there that you could turn off in time. uh, and he was like, that's a pretty wild idea. That's the kind of thing that you can write a senior thesis about. Why don't I connect you to my friend in the department who runs these things? He could be your thesis advisor. When I needed a thesis to graduate and I didn't really have a direction, so I was like, sure, I'll go talk to him. So I go talk to this other guy, and he's mentoring a PhD candidate who's actually building the world's first computer simulation of this out of left field nuclear reactor design, which, if you squint and you're incredibly generous to me, sort of looks like the thing that I came up with in my like flight of fancy, but real and actually works. It's this thing called an energy amplifier, and the idea is that basically there's this reaction you can do that produces an enormous number of neutrons, and so you don't have to have a supercritical reactor anymore, because if you've got a lot of neutrons, then the reaction doesn't need to carry out itself. You can just use this large fund of neutrons to run through the reactor. Um, so he gave me an idea, taught me a couple of classes, wound up taking a radiation detection lab from him, which was amazing. I got to do all kinds of incredible stuff, like pull the control rods out of a nuclear reactor and do radiation activation chemical detection tests and stuff like that. And that was it. That's so that then he gave me a fellowship so I could go to graduate school for a year, because they were shutting the department down, so nobody really cared. And so I got in and took a year of grad school, and then needed a job doing something that people actually do. You know I couldn't keep up with my sort of sci-fi mad science college career anymore, and that's when I got into computer tech.
Awesome. So you say you worked for some tech startups. What did you do for them?
Mostly data analysis, or some domain-specific language development. Uh, so I did some like weblog parsing and managing like the newsletter with like customization for, we called it the spam cannon back in those days.
Hmm.
Um, and then I was working for a company that was doing workflow management for publishing houses. So I built some DSLs to automatically generate some of their sites, uh, and just sort of moving around a lot because the companies kept failing because it was 2000 and then 2001 and 2002, and people with incredibly flawed business models weren't just getting free cash flown in anymore.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I worked in 1999. I worked for a startup that essentially was the precursor to the iPad. In they had this really ambitious idea that, and kids go to a restaurant, they need something to play with. And so they were going to do these tablets that they were going to put out. And as a software developer, it was really interesting to me because the hardware engineers, I'd say to them, I can't get it to do this because it doesn't tell me when it's completed this cycle. And the next day I'd come in and they'd say, we updated the firmware on your device. Try it now. It has a code for you. Like, just cool stuff that they would do. But yeah, the demise of that company was that, back in that day, a 19 to 21 inch monitor was like a couple $1,000. And every one of the management team, and there was 10 of them, had two on their desk. And the guy that was funding all of this came in one day and just said, my wallet's closed until you guys start spending the money on the product and not on your office toys. And that's, it was it was a strange time period there at the late 90s, early 2000s. So that's kind of interesting to hear. What do you think is the like the biggest problem you had to solve during your career so far?
Um, that's sort of difficult to measure in different ways. It's probably the, the project that I'm actually working on right now, which I didn't actually have to solve. I sort of wanted to. So uh, around 10 years ago now, I had finished with a company I was working with. I'd basically completely automated the job they hired me for, and this company had a policy that uh, nobody could do career advancement there. So I quit because there's nothing left. And and I had cash, and I had been very interested in math for quite some time. So I did a little bit of traveling. Mostly, I wanted to take some time to think about computational systems, and I got around to being curious about finding consensus under networked communication conditions. And I found this game theory approach to that problem. And then, after talking to a friend about, sort of the cool properties of this, I decided to turn that approach into a marketplace. And that took me about 6 months. Um, it's only a few hundred lines of code, but there was a lot of work before I started writing the code to get it all, like, lined out, and getting the math working and stuff like that. Uh, and that I've never worked on anything that I had to think about for more than a week before that one.
Took a lot of planning and thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, it's worth it in the end, though. I mean, I always love that when I used to write code, I used to love hearing someone else, especially another member of my programming team, tell me, "Oh, you're never going to get that done in that amount of time." Well, then it became a challenge, but you still have to follow all the steps to make sure you are dotting all the I's, crossing all the T's. You've thought of everything, you've mapped it out, because I get it. Like, when you don't want to get down the road and find, and we'll use a house analogy, and find out that you put a wall in a place that you don't want the wall. And now, in order to move the wall, it's like this giant nightmare to move the wall. You have to go through, hire an engineer to figure out how to move the dang wall. It's better to have your plan up front, think it all the way through, and then sit down and write the code, especially if it's only 100 lines of code. That's not a lot of code. But that's also pretty impressive. So of the startups that you worked for, is there any that really stick out in your mind, and why?
Well, I guess the first and then the last one before my hiatus are both pretty out there. The first one, they were basically one of the pioneers of social gaming. It was Merv Griffin's ex-wife and her sister had hooked up with a couple of guys who had wanted to get into like film and television production, but then decided that the internet was a cheaper production platform that they'd be able to get more use out of. And so they had these two women who were game show machines, and these two sort of ambitious kids with money. And they were like, what if we put game show type systems online where the sorts of people who like to watch game shows, i.e., married women in their 30s and 40s, could not just watch the contestants, but play the games themselves and chat with each other and so on. And so they did that. And they were getting a pretty decent number for the late 90s of customer base. I think they had well, the list was 50 to 60,000 or so, and was growing fairly rapidly. But they didn't really have a monetization plan. And it turned out that their grand plan, they were selling ad space, but their grand plan was to come up with this prize thing, and they were going to have these internet coins that were going to be worth money at other locations and stuff. It turned out that going to their prize fund area was associated with leaving the site and never returning. Their customer base loved the games, loved playing the games, hated their monetization system. And the other thing is, it turned out that while they had a fund of 50 to 100 versions of each game, because there was a lot of content in these game styles, the players actually really liked chatting with other players on these games. So most people showed up and left without really engaging. A handful of people would engage for 3 to 5. And then there was another group of people that would play hundreds. They would play every single game 5 or 6 times, because what they liked doing was just coming on and chatting with other people. So they overspent on content by a factor of 10. They overspent on their monetization strategy by a factor of infinity, because it was a complete waste of time and money. And they folded because they'd spent a bunch of money, and their plan for where to get more never materialized. In sort of the last company I was working for, the one where I sort of finished, it was actually a company that made and leased slot machines to Indian casinos, and they had just gotten a truly massive order, and they were on their way to effectively dominating the Oklahoma Indian casino market. I was somewhere between the 70th and 90th hire at the company, and I can't be more specific than that, because they probably hired 10 people the day I was hired.
Sure.
When I left 5-ish years later, they were a little over 500 people at that point. They grew like a weed. But pretty shortly after, about a year after I was there, their primary sort of development plan actually got fractured, And over the course of the following 4 years, they effectively were struggling with the fact that they had two separate incompatible code bases that they needed to reunify, and they never did. And they, in fact, never have. Um, so the last game they developed was actually developed a little bit before I left, at which point things had sort of fractured so much they couldn't move forward anymore. Uh, and a lot of that was down to the growth rate, where they'd gotten so big so fast that they were just throwing money at things and creating problems that the management team wasn't aware of. And so kind of the reason these kind of stick out for me in particular is kind of the same reason in both cases. The first one was a failure, and it collapsed and eventually got sort of sold off for scrap. The second one could easily be called a success. The guy eventually sold that company for in excess of $1 billion. But there was a great deal of potential that was essentially left on the table. And in both cases, management was making decisions which the computers that they owned had information that contradicted the sense of those decisions. And so one of my sort of motivations was that in organizations, particularly once you've sort of gotten out of all living in the same room and writing the same code on the same computer, uh, most of the information is outside of the executive's head. And that leads to executives making incredibly bad decisions because they just don't know what's going on in their own company. And so if an approach to improve information consensus and awareness exists, I think that's a very interesting thing to have access to.
I always teach my clients that as tech leaders, sometimes they need to be the one that puts the brakes on things. It sounds like the first business had a plan up to a point, and that part of the plan worked really well, the game part. And I think they underestimated what their target audience was going to be really interested in, because as you said, they weren't interested in the monetization strategy at all. And I mean, it reminds me of in the late 90s, there was a game called Hollywood Stock Market. And basically you'd buy and sell movie actors and actresses. And it's kind of like, I guess you'd say it's like fantasy sports, but for actors and actresses. And they did a similar thing, launch the game, get people interested in the game. And then they started with their monetization strategy, and the same kind of concept. Nobody liked it. And the game just died because of it, because they're not, when you're forced into that pathway and you don't like it, you don't do it. Then your second example, it just sounds like perhaps they scaled a bit faster, a lot faster than they expected. And like in a situation like that, what I would advise people is, take a breather, take a step back, look at what your plans were, and see how this rapid growth can be harnessed so that you can still control where you're headed. But I mean, if they sold it for over $1 billion, though, I mean, that's a pretty dang good success.
It was a very interesting conflation of circumstances. About, I think, a month and a half before I was hired, at which point I think the company was less than half the size that it was when I was hired. The chief operations officer and the CEO had gone into a meeting with, I think, the second biggest tribal group in Oklahoma that had decided that they didn't like IGT, which is the #1 slot machine manufacturer on earth. Those guys invented video poker, basically. And so they go to the meeting, and IGT's machines are piled up in the parking lot. So yeah, it's, you're a car salesman and somebody walks onto the lot, like it's on. So they went in and they got contracts for 40% of the space. um, and and they had one game. Um, they'd been sort of poking along, just kind of barely eking something out. And then they took that contract and they went to the next people and they were like, well, the number two people, this is what their floor is going to look like now. If you want to compete, your floor needs to look like this too. And they sold 35 to 40% of Oklahoma before they'd actually gotten around to sort of having an actual production chain in place. And it they got as far as they could get, and then they couldn't get any more. They couldn't get outside that bubble. Um, so it's an enormous thing. But on the other hand, IGT, that invented video poker, that was sort of a single good idea, and they went from nothing to 80% of an industry that has revenues in the $100-ish billion a year
Yes.
range. So these guys got less than 0.1% of market share, uh, while they became very big fish in a very small pond, effectively.
That's really interesting though, because your description of them being piled up, that's just funny. So as we're getting kind of short on time, I wanted to ask your opinion. Right now in today's world, artificial intelligence is really like at the front. People talk about it a lot. What do you think about artificial intelligence, like some of these softwares that write for you, et cetera? What are your thoughts on that?
Uh, I think AI is reached its sort of most exciting peak, and I think as a tool, it has a lot more advantages than we sort of traditionally used it in the technical space. I think its disadvantages are still pretty poorly understood. Um, and in general, learning algorithms that are also black boxes are something that I'm very uncomfortable with, because the flaws which have to exist in a black box system are things that you can't gain access to except through enormous experience. Um, However, from a kind of smoothing the edges perspective, and also a solving closed systems perspective, things like the AlphaGo, Leela chess projects, and the Alpha Folding project demonstrate that there are very important questions that are actually based on, physics, which is at the end of the day not such a big system, that we really can throw a lot of computer power at and get some very valuable insights out of. My system is in fact, in one sense, an artificial intelligence system. It's a learning
Right.
approach. However, I'm very consciously, because of the game theory aspect, integrating not just machine perspectives but human perspectives as well. And I think that creating super minds, is something that's both common. I think markets have been around for centuries and that they functionally operate as super minds. So I think that artificial superintelligence, if you will, or sort of assisted superintelligence, is something that is is common, that we've actually built our societies around at this point, and something that we can do better with using the technology that we have. And so I think it's something that you should be thinking about how to pursue, because if you're in a competitive industry and your competition figures out how to do it, if there's a bunch of farmers and one of them's got a John Deere and the rest of them are standing behind an ox, pretty soon the guy with the John Deere is going to own all the farms. And that's kind of where we are right now, is that while there's some skull sweat required, if we can, the technology is there to be able to make things that work better than what we have. And so that means that if you're not doing it, then your lunch is likely to be about to be eaten by somebody who's going to figure it out.
You mentioned AlphaZero, and I mentioned earlier that I'm a chess player, and like that the way they taught that computer software to play chess is ingenious, first of all. But it's already had a huge impact on the game itself. I mean, there's strategies that would have never been employed before that are now. But
I think, yeah, I think it's actually quite fascinating that, so computers were already much stronger than people at chess, but because the way that they were stronger than people at chess was so foreign to the way that we're actually even capable of playing chess, that while people were getting better, we weren't really learning much from the computers about chess, whereas the Alpha Leela, those types of things are playing chess not just at a much higher level and in far better ways, but in ways that human experts can sort of watch and extract principles from. And so people have learned these new principles about chess that human beings had never figured out before. And yeah, I think that's a well-made point.
well, yeah, I mean, like even Magnus Carlsen is the current world champion, and he won't be for much longer because he decided not to defend his title. I personally think he's bored. He literally told them that unless this one particular young grandmaster was his opponent, that he wasn't interested in defending his title, which kind of tells me that he thinks that that's his only real competition. But he's rightfully so. He's kind of cocky, but at the same time, he's humble. Which is kind of a weird combination. So he'll never come out and say, "Oh, the rest of you guys aren't competition for me." But it's kind of inferred. But what I'm getting at here is he's employed like they call the pawn all the way on the right side the H pawn, and he's employed like using that pawn to attack the opponent's king, exactly like AlphaZero does.
Yeah.
And
Because
it's changed the game.
Right. Yeah, because it really does work better. And once you watch the computer destroy other computers that are vastly better than you dozens of
Yeah.
times, you start noticing, hey, this thing happens over and over again and it keeps working. And because the computer's trained to make moves based on probability of victory, it does build up these patterns of things where it's making the move that looks like it's going to lead it towards victory. And so it has its own special patterns of, maybe I don't need to castle as often because I can just win because I've got an extra move, or the H pawn, or other patterns like that. I'm not much of a chess expert, but I follow this from sort of the opposite angle of being interested in these techniques that are being used to have the computers now teach themselves how to be even better.
Well, and on the chess world, the AI is being used to help teach other people how to play. Like there's a startup right now called AIM Chess, AIM Chess, and you can go into AIM Chess, get an account. It's perfectly free at the moment. Of course, they'll find a way to monetize it, which I hope they do. It's perfectly free, and you basically connect any of the online chess playing locations. You connect your account, and then as you play games on those places, it's pulling your game data in, and then it's presenting you with lessons around your own games in your own positions. I mean, I've used it and I'll say to myself, why does this position look so familiar? And then I'll realize that looks familiar because I just played that yesterday. And it pulls it in and it teaches you where you've made mistakes. And it has like multiple different drills. And that's where it's going. They're trying to take AI and have it teach humans how to play better. That's the obvious end game there. What I wonder is like with things like Chat GPT and like Jasper, they have to be gaining a lot of data and knowledge about what people are interested in just by the questions that are asked, what the inputs that are given to it. And I'm wondering, like, what's the end game there? What are they going to do with all of this massive data that they compile about people's requests to these, AI softwares. And I mean, like Chat GPT has gone so crazy that if you try to go to their site and use it, you're lucky right now if you can, because they didn't expect it to be so popular right away, so they didn't build in good scaling for it. But I mean, it's what I'm finding interesting is that people, for instance, like people use a lot of AI tools for writing content for their website, and they're saying that Google is working on a way to identify that and then penalize them. And I say to myself, I don't understand why you'd want to penalize them, because let's say I'm a copywriter and you're building a website, so you hire me to write your copy. You didn't write it, I did. So why it's no different than if I let the AI write it for me.
Well, another part and parcel of that is that process will actually create a Darwinian reinforcement thing to improve the algorithms themselves. So another AI inspired thing is the deep fake, which
Yep.
has some impressive things, but occasionally really is pretty ugly. And there's some famous cases. Was it the Luke Skywalker cameo in whatever it was, where some random person on the internet was able to actually make it look like Mark Hamill when the actual pros doing the thing at the time couldn't. But one of the things that happened in that community was people built detectors. Like I'm going to build something that can look at this thing and find out whether or not something bad is happening here. Is there a fake in there? Well, then once you've got a trained detector, you've got the exact tool you need to train a better version. Can you make a fake that gets past the detector? Well, it'll look better if you can. So then you
Right.
can train a new generation of better fakes. I with my sort of journey into the financial world, I ran into a woman who was in the reg tech space, and she had worked with a startup that had uh, trained up an AI to detect money laundering behavior. And so they had taken marketplaces like stock markets where known money laundering had happened historically, and then sort of other random days where that wasn't going on, and done some uh, distinction training. And so then it was able to say, okay, this here this day looks suspicious, check out these sorts of players, and then go after money laundering. However, they had a stumbling block. They uh, they went after commodity markets, to do their thing, and their algorithm was incapable of distinguishing money laundering from non-money laundering days. And the basically the two possibilities they came up with are: one, because the interests of commodity markets are so different from the interests of stock and bond type markets, that it was just too difficult to actually find these types of things; or two, um, because money laundering and manipulation is so trivial and easy in commodity markets, it might be so common that there's no such thing as a clean day to actually train against.
Right. Right. So it
And
can't
so,
so it can't figure out the patterns that it's supposed to be figuring out, because they're kind of
right.
muddied up in the
Yeah. So
normal
like
world.
you're trying to train a facial recognition algorithm to like tell the difference between some movie star and other people, but you train it where every face it ever sees is the movie star, and it can't tell the difference between Tom Cruise and anybody else, because everyone it's ever seen is Tom Cruise.
Well, Noah, this has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. But why don't you tell my listeners like where they could find you if they want to reach out and get more information about what you're up to?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the easiest way to reach out to me is my email address, noahphealy@yahoo.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the Noah Healey there. And I have a website at coordisc.com. That's COORDISC. where you can find out more about my marketplace ideas.
All right, well, we'll make sure that gets into the description for the video and in the show notes for the audio. That way people can find you easier and they don't have to rapidly grab a pen and try to write it all down. That's always never fun. But again, thank you so much for being on. This was our first episode and I couldn't have thought of a more interesting way to kick it off. Actually, it kind of worked out nicely. I think some of the insight that you've had has kind of blown my mind a bit. So really appreciate it. So this has been the first episode of Gaining the Technology Leadership Edge. And this is a show that's going to come out every week. Just come on back and let's learn some things from the smart people that are going to be on this show.